If you've been wondering what's going on with Unity's new networking system and how to get started with it, then you're in the right place. This video is actually a full session from the GameDev Guild conference that I just hosted, including the Q&A where people asked a lot of great questions and paid a good amount to be there. Yeah, of course, I'm not going to ask you to pay to watch the video or ask your own questions, but I will ask to please hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, like the video, share it, or anything that you can do to kind of help push and share this stuff out. If you think it's interesting and want to see more, then you hitting the button at the very least makes a big difference. All right, I'll stop begging for likes now and let's get started with the session, Netcode for GameObjects. We got two parts again, the full session and then a Q&A afterwards with Luke. We'll dive into all of the biggest questions. I'll put chapters in as well. All right, now we'll get started. Thanks for joining us here today, Cosmin. I'm really excited to have you here. Before we get started, can you give everybody just a quick introduction to yourself and what it is that you're doing at Unity?
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Jason. My name is Cosmin Boraru, and I'm a lead Netcode engineer here at Unity. I'm responsible for the Netcode Solution Architect team, which is a team composed of highly specialized Netcode engineers. And we're trying to help internal teams, solve very hard Netcode challenges and, advocate for our users internally.
Nice. That's something I think everybody's going to be really excited about, and you're probably going to have a lot of fans after this video because a lot of people are really interested in what's going on with Netcode for Unity and the whole networking system. So can you give us a little bit of history and a brief overview of what's been going on and what the plans are with Unity's networking system?
Yeah, absolutely, which is why I guess I prepared this presentation for you. So I guess I can start by giving you an introduction to today's agenda, if possible. So the first part of this presentation will be about what Jason just asked, which is Unity's Netcode, history of frameworks and timelines. Then I'll walk you through some standout features, as well as help you understand what games you can actually build and develop and release today with Netcode for GameObjects. And then after that, I'll give a high-level overview of multiplayer game architectures for different network topologies. And at last, I'll talk about a glimpse of what the future of multiplayer at Unity would look like. So, moving on. Quite a few years ago, Unity released its first-party Netcode library called UNET. Whilst many users enjoyed using it and have been successful with it and releasing quite a few high-profile titles, many others have found it difficult to use, or it wasn't supporting well enough their use cases. So as such, Unity listened quite closely to all of your feedback, and we announced its formal deprecation around 2018. Now, ever since, Unity has been striving to find a solution. Therefore, we decided to heavily invest in the space by creating a new multiplayer group within Unity. And our first public announcement after new UNET deprecation was around 2020 in December, when we acquired MLAPI. Now, not long after that, in March 2021, we had our first experimental release of MLAPI, where we've done quite a few improvements to it, as well as adding experimental support of our Unity transport package. Later in the year, with the release of our 2021.2 text stream, after many more feature additions, improvements, and refactors to MLAPI, we announced its transition from experimental to pre-release, as well as the fact that we renamed it to Netcode for GameObjects. Now, I'm happy to say that since then, all the teams have worked on stabilizing and improving it, as well as listening closely to the feedback of our community. And since this week, we have officially released our first release candidate. This means that from 2022.2 Unity text stream release in October, Netcode for GameObjects version 1 will become fully released and will be supported for the next 2 years of LTS. It's also important to mention that, with Unity 2022, UNET has been completely removed and should no longer be used. Instead, we recommend our users to migrate to the new Netcode for GameObjects solution. Okay. In the multiplayer space today, even outside of Unity, there are many services or libraries available to choose from. Libraries provide an SDK which can be used to develop a multiplayer game, whilst services can help you launch and scale that game. At Unity, there are two very big organizations that drive the multiplayer development forward. The operate part of the business has a variety of services for multiplayer and backend solutions. We from Create focus on creating these libraries which allow users to implement networking functionality in their projects. Unity provides both services and libraries to our users. And whilst our libraries and services can work independently of each other, we're striving to provide a good integration layer between them. And more updates on this very soon. Okay, for the new users in the multiplayer space at Unity, the Unity Transport Package, or UTP in short, is a layer right above the network sockets. This implements a reliable UDP protocol, as well as efficient transmission of data and more. One thing to note that UTP is used by both Netcode for GameObjects, as well as Netcode for Entities package. Now, Netcode for GameObjects, on the other hand, it's a higher level library that consists of a network simulation and synchronization layer, connection management features, and more, and it works hand in hand with your gameplay code. The two services I will reference today a lot are the relay and lobby ones, which are part of the UGS suite. These usually work hand in hand together, but can also be used independently. The lobby service allows players to be grouped together in a game session and will generate a join code to share. Once the game session is started by the host, the relay server would help transmit the data between the host and the client, and it will act as an intermediary between the two, nothing more, nothing less. The relay service is very friendly to co-op game archetypes, and is usually much cheaper than hosting your own dedicated game server. Now, let's talk some more details about our first NGO release. The first support release that will happen later this year is targeted at indie or mid-market generalists developers without prior network development experience. So the minimum supported Unity version will be 2020.3 LTS and all the way to the current major versions. The most important takeaway of this slide is about the game archetypes supported. I cannot stress this enough. This release is solely aimed at small-scale cooperative multiplayer titles of the likes of Among Us, Animal Crossing, Overcooked 2, Luigi's Mansion, and where the number of players per session is up to 10 and the amount of network objects in the world that requires synchronization is low. Developing bigger scale games is not supported well, and that requires advanced knowledge to implement different networking techniques that would vastly improve CPU performance as well as cut down on the bandwidth costs. With this release,
scaling up the number of sessions like on Among Us, you can definitely do that with this, right? You can still have your small multiplayer game and scale it up to a giant scale with the services.
Yeah, technically yes, but it also depends on the amount of objects you have to synchronize, and the CPU time that you require, and also at the same time it's also about what sort of mechanics you need for your game. Because if it's about like a physics body simulation and networking, that aspect is quite hard in today's world, because as you will see in just a moment, NGO features a several authoritative architecture and does not have all the other techniques for smoothing like client prediction and rollback, having a snapshot system and so more. Going on, one thing that I want to say as well is that with this release, most platforms will be supported the same as Unity is supporting, besides the web ones. But that may still be possible with the use of custom third-party transport, such as the ones our community have released. I'll have some resources links up at the end of this presentation. Okay, so in this slide, I'm showcasing some standout features of Netcode for GameObjects in the 1.0 release. Whilst I'm not going to read every single one for you, I believe it's worth mentioning the two last features we have added in the very recent weeks. So one of the features that was initially removed and was missed a lot by the community was the ability for the clients to write directly to the network variable state rather than sending an RPC to the server, where the server will do the modification to this specific network variable and then it will replicate back to all the clients. We listened to your feedback and we have re-added a simpler version and a more cleaner version of it back into the framework and will be available with this release. Another top requested feature we added recently was the ability to make use of addressable workflows. This should allow users to handle streaming in and out of assets as well as downloading them from a remote CDN server. This will help you keep your runtime memory as well as the initial application download size on platforms with constraints such as mobile under your control. Now, with all this information presented to you, I believe it's a good moment for me to present the two most common ways to architect your multiplayer game with Netcode for GameObjects today. So the first one is the best supported use case by far, and that's the listen server client architecture using our relay and lobby service, which is also the one that our first party sample boss room is using. As mentioned previously, the lobby would help you group your players together and get a join code that will be used for the relay server once the network session starts. As illustrated on the right side, the relay server would act as an intermediary between the clients and the host. It just passes the data sent by the host to the client and back. NGO would help simulate and synchronize the gameplay state. This would happen on the host server side. As I mentioned, NGO features a server authoritative architecture. And last but not least, the Unity transport will help with the efficient transmission of your packets between the client and host via relay. Another possible but less supported approach is to use a dedicated game server. This, however, requires you to host your server with one of the hosting companies or hosting services. One that we have is called Multiplay, which allows you to orchestrate the game servers and host them on their data centers. And to help your users find a common session, you can use our matchmaking service to group them together. Now, once a session has been found and the network session is started, NGO and UTP will run the simulation and send the packets to the client and server, exactly similar to the listen server and client architecture described previously. There will be almost no difference. The only difference in this whole diagram is the fact that there won't be any intermediary, server between the client and the actual server. It will be, the server will send packets to the client, and the client will send packets back to the server directly. Now, here you can see a diagram to better understand how Netcode for GameObjects, Unity Transport, as well as the lobby and relay work together. It's important to highlight that Netcode for GameObjects features a modular transport interface so that any third-party transports, such as Steamworks, for example, can be used as long as the interface contract is respected. Okay, now let me walk you through a quick overview of NGO workflows. So I categorize them into three main ones: setup, authoring, and scripting. For the setup part, once the NGO package is added for your project, you can get started by creating an empty object in your scene, add a network manager component to that object, set your player prefab, and choose a transport. One thing to note here is that in this case, the Unity transport package will be imported to your project automatically upon upon importing the NGO package. So they'll come both at the same time. And it can be selected from the network transport dropdown on the right-hand side. Now you can hit the play button afterwards, then use the start-stop buttons in the inspector to start or stop a multiplayer session. And you can, of course, do that from code as well with your own UI implementation. Now, for the authoring part, this example showcases how you can create a game object that will be replicated to everyone. To start, you have to attach a network object component to a game object, place this object either in the scene or make a prefab out of it, and you can use code to spawn them at runtime. But don't forget to register it to the network manager. And also, one more thing, please notice the network transform component as well as the example script, as I will reference both in the upcoming slides. Okay, in this little snippet of code, I'm showcasing some of the basic callbacks that are often used within your network gameplay code. These callbacks on network spawn and on network despawn usually may replace start and destroy, but those are only called upon the start of a network session, and only within that. As soon as you stop it, they're not going to be called. Okay, in the update function here, I'm showcasing some conditionals. Pretty much, those are booleans that would allow you that will tell you which mode you're running your network manager in. One thing to note that these are only available once you inherit your class from the network behavior. You can still access the conditionals pretty much by accessing the singleton instance of the network manager. Okay, so by following the previous information, I created a script that allows you to move your network object based on the mouse position. One thing to note here is that the update function would run across all machines that the network object with your example script is attached on. So as such, we need to isolate the raycast part of the mouse input to only run on your own machine, and therefore the isOwner conditional is used. So upon mouse input, if we hit something, we are sending an RPC event to the server where we set the target position. Then the server will move its own version of the transform towards that. The network transform component we have attached to our game object in the previous slides allows the server to synchronize this position with all the clients. Smoothing is also applied via the network transform, as it has a mechanism implemented to buffer up and interpolate the position changes. And again, you'll find way more sources of inspiration at the end of this presentation. Okay, now let's talk about the future. So whilst I don't have any new release timelines or ETAs available to share with you, I really want to highlight that throughout the past year up until today, our team has learned and grown a lot. And we're completely aware about the areas that need our attention to unlock more game archetypes, for example, fast-paced action games, and we're working on those areas. Additionally, we have listened to your valuable feedback that has been shared through our roadmap website, as well as through our communication channels, such as Discord and forums. Therefore, I encourage you to continue reaching out to us to ensure that your voice is heard and we can take it into consideration. One thing I'm going to add, and I'll wrap up with this. You've seen at the beginning and throughout this presentation our Unity game services suite, as well as our libraries that we're developing, and how they could interact with each other. We will continue to add more seamless integration between them, because our mission here is to empower our users to choose Unity as a first-class citizen engine to build your multiplayer game. And for people that might have not already seen the announcement, most of the Unity game services will have their general availability release next month in June. Okay, here's the list of resources I mentioned. And of course, I'll make sure that this will be available to you with the help of Jason and his team. Okay, thank you very much for joining today, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation and you find it very useful. And again, please feel free to continue to reach out to my team, which is always available on Discord and through the resources that have been shared. With that, I guess I'll pass it over to Jason.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say that I am extremely excited and amazed. This looks perfect. It's exactly what I was hoping for. And I think that a lot of people are going to be really thrilled to get in and start using Netcode for GameObjects. You really kind of boiled down the current use case, the plans, and just how easy it is to get started, and the actual network architecture and the overview of how you actually set things up and how they work in the right way was great. So we'll make sure that all of those resources are down below, and then we'll start taking people's questions.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, Luke. And before we get started, thanks to Cosmin for that awesome talk. And sorry to everybody for my grainy looking video. I don't know what happened to the internet out here. So I wanted to say, welcome, Luke. Make sure that your mic's working, and then dive into questions, because it looks like quite a few are starting to come in. A lot of people are curious about Netcode for GameObjects and multiplayer development in general.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Happy to be here and very excited to answer your questions. So where should we start?
Well, let's pop up the first one and we'll get going. So this one is from somebody who's saying they've never considered making a multiplayer game before. So we'll come at it with the context of having never considered building a multiplayer game. Are there tutorials for complete newbies at making a multiplayer implementation using the new Netcode? So is there something out there that's really beginner friendly, or is this something that the documentation is more aimed at people who are already experienced with multiplayer, and then the beginner friendly things coming later? Can you talk about that a little?
Definitely. So one thing we have in our documentation is a golden path, that's a series of small text tutorials, and they're step by step. They lead you through creating a game, like a very simple Hello World kind of game with moving cubes using Netcode. And they start at the very beginning. So if you're not entirely familiar with Unity, they even go through setting up a project and ending up with something working where players can connect together and move in a shared space. And besides that, I think there's also a lot of great resources around on YouTube, which are pretty beginner friendly. Like you can search for videos there. Yeah.
Nice. I think there's probably a lot of stuff out there, and I think there'll be probably a lot more coming soon. I plan on doing a couple videos on Netcode for GameObjects myself. So I wanted to jump over to the next question, which is really just about comparison. So this one reads, how does Netcode for GameObjects compare to FishNet? But I think that's just because we had a talk about FishNet on Monday. I'm really curious how Netcode for GameObjects compares to kind of the whole networking ecosystem for Unity. So like Photon, Mirror, all of the common things that people know about. Where do you kind of lay out Netcode for GameObjects, and what's the plan for there?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. And I try to avoid direct comparisons because obviously I work at Unity, so there is bias involved. And I think it's just overall better if we rather point out what our products are best at. So with Netcode, what we focused on is getting that production ready experience for something like a co-op game, right? So we wanted to make sure that even when you go further into development, you're all set. So we have features like built-in addressable support, which I think is something other solutions don't have. We have stuff. What else do we offer? We have stuff like client rights, and we have built-in solutions for that. So it's very easy to create like a client authoritative style of game. And when it comes to scale, we're just trying to stay modest right now. So we're not advertising large scale games because we know currently in the space, there's a lot of solutions where you run into issues. So yeah, anything kind of small scale, you can use Netcode for that.
Nice. Let's pop up the next question. This one's a little bit more specific, and they're wondering how well Netcode for GameObjects deals with physics. So, can you use this? You talked about like a small multiplayer co-op game. Would that be a co-op game that's using physics systems, or do you fake that, or how well does that all kind of integrate in?
So getting physics right with multiplayer is very tricky. There is lots of ways to do this wrong. One way which we support, which can work quite well in certain scenarios, is having a fully server authoritative solution. So what that means is that on the server, you run your physics simulation, but then the clients, they just replicate that visually. And for a lot of games, that works completely fine. If you're looking for something faster, let's say you have a VR title and you really can't live with that latency, it gets incredibly tricky because you need to understand that on your client you have a predicted object and you need to have that collide with other objects in the world. So solving that needs a proper implementation of what we call client-side prediction. And I think right now in the market, the only solutions which provide that are our .NET Netcode stack. And I think Photon Fusion also has some options for that.
But let's take that into the next question here because it's very related. You're talking about how I set this all up, and it was, how do you need to think differently when building a multiplayer game as opposed to building something single player?
I think there's a key points to that. One thing is you kind of need to think, you need to understand what's state and what's an event. And what I mean by that is that if you have a player position, that is a game state. So when a player moves around, that's a persistent state. And when a new player connects, you also want that player to be at that position. And one issue I see a lot of beginners make is that they use events or RPCs to change something in the game world, like displaying a scoreboard or something. But that's not persistent. So if someone disconnects and reconnects, they end up with a different session. It's like one of the things. Another thing is really test your game, test it early, and test it with latency and multiple players. And there are some tools for that around. Our transport package is a built-in way to simulate latency. And there are some tools like Clumsy on Windows, which allow you to simulate package loss and extra delay. I'd really recommend using those.
And let's go on to another one. Sorry, we're going through lots of questions because there are quite a few of them here. I want to make sure we can get to them. But this one's about local testing. This is something that I've run into a lot where you're building a multiplayer game and you want to test the server and the client or multiple clients, and you're trying to figure out how to kind of get this process down so that it's easy. So the question here reads, is there some kind of automation to select which one's the server and the client? But I kind of want to go beyond that into, are there any like tips or workflows that you recommend for doing this multiplayer building and debugging? Do you set up multiple instances? Do you automate a build pipeline? Do you have like some little asset or trick that you use? What are your recommendations here?
So for me, when it comes to this, iteration speed is key, right? So when you want to test your multiplayer game as a developer, you don't want to spend up 5 minutes building, or if you have a large project, it might even take half an hour or longer, right? So that's something you want to avoid. What we use internally for that, like on some of our projects, like the boss room sample, is we use a tool called Parallel Sync. And what that does, it allows you to open two Unity editor instances of your game. So you basically have two Unity editors and both can enter play mode. And then one can be a server and the other a client, and they can connect to each other and you can play a game session together. So that makes it very easy to iterate. And then you can even go further. So you can set it up in a way where one editor automatically starts as a server and as a client. So you basically don't need to even do anything. You just enter play mode on both and you're connected and good to go. We are also working on some ways to provide this from our side so that you don't need to use a third-party tool. So you can look forward to that, but we don't have a release date or anything for that yet.
Nice. And can you just, for anybody who missed the name of that tool, retell them what it was? Because it's something I've used before and I think they should know about.
It's Peril, I think.
Yeah, definitely go check that out. If you haven't used it, it'll allow you to do this very easily, so you don't have to have 2 copies of your project or anything. You just end up with essentially like 2 library folders, I think, and 2 build ones, but you're good. It's super easy to use and definitely needed for multiplayer development. I think every multiplayer dev I know uses that or something similar. They've got some system like that set up. Let's jump over to the next one about kind of when to integrate into your game. So is it easy enough to integrate Netcode at the back end of the development cycle, or would you suggest integrating it from the beginning? Which is kind of like a one of those questions: should I make my game multiplayer from the start, or should I build a single player game and then make it multiplayer and network later, or maybe online versus local? What are your thoughts there? Where do you recommend people start?
I think people underestimate how much harder it is to integrate multiplayer into an already working game. So I think if you are certain, like fairly certain that you're going to ship a multiplayer game, or if that's like the core gameplay for your game, I'd make sure to start with multiplayer. And the only reason to not start with multiplayer would really be if you're like short in your release time, right? If you need to get something out and you know multiplayer won't make the cut, then yeah, you go for a single player game. But later on, it will be much harder to integrate multiplayer. Yeah, so start from the beginning, test the multiplayer modes, and anything you develop which is like gameplay related really needs to keep that multiplayer in mind.
Yeah, I definitely completely agree there. I think if you're building a multiplayer game, you've got to think about it a little bit different. You might prototype and concept it out as a single player, like, oh, this should be multiplayer, then start doing it right away. Don't try to do it later. It is possible, and I know like I've seen talks from John Carmack about his genius. Like, I'm just gonna go make this cool game into multiplayer and invent some network FPS stuff. But that's not the other millions of us out there. So let's go on to the next question. I don't know if you know the
There are
answer to this.
also
Go
there
ahead.
are also like some things which translate better into multiplayer than others. Like for instance, you see there is a lot of first-person shooters out there. It's a genre which works very well. And then there is like games, if you go into like destructible environments or voxel-based games, those are like really hard to get right. So just knowing what kind of game you're creating and whether that fits multiplayer can be very useful, because some of these are very challenging to build. The same applies for like physics related games, right? Those are more tricky because FPS games, they use character controllers. They don't have actual game physics, which makes them very simple to build, for instance.
All good advice. And I got to say, I really do appreciate you being here. I want to see if you know the answer to this one, though. I don't know for sure because I know this is kind of a separate department, but they're wondering how the entire Unity network infrastructure, the lobby, chat, and matchmaking and all that stuff is going to work alongside some of the other systems. I think of like Steam, Epic, Xbox, the PlayStation, the ones that are here. So is there any like integration or tie-in or something that people need to think about or know about with that? Or is that kind of, I know that's again a kind of a separate part of the platform, but it's something you guys integrate with. So I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that. So what's really important for us is we don't want to lock players out from playing with each other. So our services and our netcode products, they're designed in a way which allows you to use them on a cross-platform basis on every platform. There might be some limitations for specific platforms, but they're not from our side, but they would be based on the specific platform. We also allow you for something like Netcode for GameObjects to integrate platform-specific services. So, for instance, you could use the Steam Relay as a basis for our Netcode for GameObjects solution. And that's completely fine.
Let's take this next question here. It's about netcode for game objects and integrating with something of your own, which is netcode for dots. So they're curious, given the move to kind of more have dots complement and integrate well with game objects. We've seen a lot of talks about that in the last 2 days, about how you can just kind of pull it in and kind of mix and match and combine and get the best of both worlds there. They're wondering if there are any plans for netcode for game object and netcode for dots to kind of play nicely together, or maybe be interchangeable, intercommunicable. Can you talk a little bit about that? Honestly, I don't know a whole lot about Netcode for dots, so I don't know where those are, and I think that everybody would probably learn quite a bit here.
So Netcode for entities or Netcode for dots has been specifically built to work with entities. So the network object equivalent of that solutions are ECS entities. So that solution is specifically built for high performance, fast paced games. It has a lot of features which allow you to do client side predictions, stuff like that, very fast rollbacks. It can synchronize a large amount of players. So that's what we're focusing on there. And with GameObjects, we do the opposite, right? We focus on GameObjects. And when it comes to mixing the two, it gets a bit tricky because usually your game simulation, like the core gameplay, uses either of those. So I think most players, people using Netcode for GameObjects would be using just that. But one thing which might be worth to note is we're using a lot of the dot stack internally. So some of that Unity technology like Jobs and Burst, they help us speed up our Netcode for GameObject stack. So while from the outside it looks like a mono-behavior GameObject-based solution, we also try to make it as high performance as we can.
Nice. So it sounds like they probably could just stick with Netcode for GameObjects, and then if they need to do one of the things like Johnny was showing earlier and do these integrations, they could have the Netcode for dots or Netcode for entities as their thing, with entities running the stuff that's networked, and then pass that back up to normal game objects as an alternate way to do it. And my guess is I don't want to put any words in anybody's mouth that in the next 5 or 10 years it's all going to be merged into some one magical thing. So I want to take one last question here that I think is really important for everybody, and it's about where to find or what tutorials are available out there for the boss room networking setup. They want to know what the best place is to get started in terms of understanding its components and kind of how it works. So is there like a walkthrough tutorial there, or the documents out there, something that you would point people to that we can share with everybody?
Unfortunately, right now there is not. We have an architecture text file in the repository which goes a bit over the basics for how the project is structured. But our lead samples engineer is very passionate about this. We really want to use Boss Room as a teaching tool. And we have a lot of video and text-based lectures based where we take parts of Boss Room and use those to explain specific concepts to you. But that's all still work in progress, but you can look forward to that.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to that, 'cause I think it would be a really useful way to show people kind of how to do this multiplayer stuff, and really kind of how to get started in a nice, clean way. So before we wrap it up, I just want to see if there are any other final bits of advice you've got for people who are looking at getting into using Netcode for game objects, either from switching away from something or maybe building their first bit of a multiplayer game. Anything you want to kind of leave people with as the Netcode for game objects tips?
I don't know. Give it a try, give it a spin. If it fits, yeah, use it. Else, there's also a lot of other good solutions around. Like, think like if you're creating a multiplayer game with Unity today, you're in a great space. We have all these amazing services from Unities, from other companies. We have all these products which are coming up and getting really high quality, which allow you to very easily build a game. So yeah, just pick whatever works for you.
Nice. And we've got a giant list of resources that we'll share too. So those will be linked somewhere, either in Gather, Discord, and probably on the page. And you come back later, make sure, or and on the specific talk too. So you'll be able to get to all of those and kind of start figuring it out, getting used to network playing or building network games, and I think pulling people in and having a lot of fun. So thanks again, Luke. And again, thanks to Cosmin, who did that awesome presentation for us. Really appreciate it, and I hope we can talk again soon about Netcode and see the new exciting stuff that's coming.